They were the worst sort of vandal.
How could the data of 100 million Americans be put at risk by a child? The CIA, the FBI, security systems designed to withstand attacks from hostile nations. And yet, they found themselves outmaneuvered by a teenager who wasn't even old enough to drive. In 2010, when the Barack Obama administration publicly declared cybersecurity a matter of national security, America still believed its critical systems were strong enough to withstand any external threat.
The United States is positioned to lead in the 21st century.
But at the very same time, inside Washington, D.C., emergency meetings were quietly taking place after a series of incidents that no one could explain. 70,000 internal emails from a cybersecurity firm working directly with the FBI were suddenly exposed. Subsequent reports revealed that more than 100 million personal records belonging to U.S. citizens had, at one point, been placed at risk. Names, email addresses, passwords, and contact information.
In recent breaches, more than 100 million Americans had their personal data compromised.
The consequences unfolded rapidly. A CEO was forced out. Federal agencies were compelled to conduct a full review of their systems, and the White House publicly warned of a cyber war.
And as part of our comprehensive strategy, we've boosted our defenses in government. We're sharing more information with the private sector to help those companies defend themselves.
What makes this story truly bitter is not the scale of the damage, but its origin. The chain reaction that sent shockwaves through Washington was triggered from a place no one ever expected, by someone whom U.S. law still classified, at the time, as a minor. How could something this absurd happen? And what was the real price of it? In 2013, at TEDx King's College London, a young man walked onto the stage and faced the audience with a calm that bordered on cold detachment.
That's what I had to do in 2013, because I was legally banned from the internet by the police for just under 2 years.
Just one sentence, short, emotionless. But for those who understood the story behind it, the statement revealed an almost unbelievable paradox. At one point, a teenager had been considered such a serious risk that he was stripped of access to the internet, the very infrastructure the modern world depends on every second. By then, the question was no longer what he had done. It was, what had driven events so far that it came to this? To answer that, we have to go back long before the headlines, before the cyber attacks, and even before the moment the United States began to pay attention. This story does not begin in London. It begins in Baghdad in 1995, and it begins with a boy whose name the global cybersecurity world would one day be forced to remember: Mustafa al-Bassam. Mustafa al-Bassam was born in 1995 in Baghdad, Iraq. Around 2001, when he was just 6 years old, he and his family immigrated to the United Kingdom, eventually settling in southeast London. They were an ordinary immigrant family, trying to rebuild their lives in a new country. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that this boy would one day be linked to events serious enough to capture the attention of the entire United States. But everything began to change in 2003, when Mustafa was 8 years old. One day, his father brought home a computer. At first, it was entirely ordinary, playing games, clicking around, casual curiosity, just like any other child. But Mustafa's curiosity did not stop at entertainment. He didn't just want to play. He wanted to understand how the computer actually worked. That curiosity quickly turned into obsession. Mustafa began teaching himself programming, algorithms, encryption, and data analysis entirely on his own, with no formal guidance. At an age when most children were still learning how to type properly, Mustafa was already building websites using Microsoft Front Page. Mustafa began spending more and more time focused on what lay behind the screen: lines of code, invisible rules that determined how everything functioned. His family didn't think much of it. A child obsessed with computers seemed no different from one obsessed with soccer or comic books. There was nothing to worry about. Until one day, when Mustafa was 9 years old, while using an online calculator website to do his homework, he stumbled upon something most users would never notice. The site's underlying code could be directly manipulated. No locks, no warnings. It was as if someone had built a door and simply forgotten to lock it. Mustafa tried changing one small detail, then another, and within a short time, he found himself able to control the entire website. This was his first intrusion, unplanned, without any larger objective, and without even the awareness that he had just crossed an important line. To Mustafa, it was simply a technical experiment, but to the system, it was a reminder. Even tools designed for children are not flawless. From that moment on, Mustafa began testing other systems, and among all those experiments, there was one incident he remembered more clearly than the rest. Not because it was the most complex, but because it was the closest to home. He decided to access the system of the very school he was attending. Inside the system Mustafa entered, there were no state secrets or grand conspiracies. Just teacher records, payroll information, and student grades. Data that seemed ordinary, yet was clearly never meant to be seen by a student. And the very next day, the school realized something was wrong. Mustafa was called in for a formal meeting. The atmosphere in the room was serious and cautious. He was asked direct questions about how he had accessed the system and what his intentions had been. For the school, this was the moment they needed to determine exactly what they were dealing with. After reviewing the entire situation, the school concluded that Mustafa's actions had not caused any concrete damage. All signs suggested this was a boundary crossed out of curiosity, not a deliberate or malicious threat. As a result, the incident was resolved quickly, treated more as a technical mishap within a school environment than as a matter requiring deeper investigation. After the incident at school, Mustafa's curiosity didn't disappear. It simply evolved. The question shifted from "how far can I go?" to something much bigger. Who else out there is doing this? If he could teach himself and push boundaries that far, there was no way he was alone. Mustafa began observing how others viewed the digital world. In the process, he kept encountering the same name with increasing frequency across tech forums, international news reports, and even in government documents that were never meant for public release. Anonymous. This was not a group with an official website or a membership list. Anonymous existed in fragments, within semi-private discussions, anonymous chat channels, and links that appeared only briefly before disappearing. Mustafa didn't join in the traditional sense. He followed their trail. He read their conversations. He watched how anonymous participants analyzed targets, broke tasks into pieces, and disappeared at the right moment. There were no leaders, no orders. No one asked who he was, how old he was, or where he came from. There was only one question. What could he do? When Operation Payback began to take shape, Mustafa became involved at a very low level. At first, he was simply testing tools, handling technical tasks, and taking on work no one paid much attention to. No one knew he was a teenager, and on the internet, that didn't matter. The results spoke for him. Gradually, he was no longer standing on the outside observing. He was inside, anonymous. It was at that moment, in 2010, when WikiLeaks, an organization dedicated to publishing classified documents, anonymously provided by insiders within governments and corporations, with the aim of exposing hidden information, released a wave of sensitive files that a chain reaction began to spread. The pressure did not remain confined to politics or diplomacy. It quickly spilled over into the financial world. Many major organizations decided to cut off all donation flows to WikiLeaks. On paper, it was described as a technical or compliance measure. But to Anonymous, it sent a clear political message. Economic power could be used to control information. The response came almost immediately. No announcement, no warning. MasterCard became the target. Not because it was WikiLeaks, but because it represented the mechanism of control behind the scenes. The systems of a global financial corporation were disrupted long enough to force the world to pay attention. The media stepped in. Emergency meetings were called. A company worth tens of billions of dollars was compelled to publicly explain why its systems had failed. Mustafa was part of that operation. For the first time, he no longer saw hacking as a purely technical puzzle. He witnessed how a single action in digital space could generate real-world pressure. Lines of code were no longer just altering a website. They could force powerful organizations to respond publicly. A few months after Operation Payback, events had moved far beyond a symbolic act of protest. In December 2010, Tunisia plunged into unrest as citizens took to the streets to protest the government of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, a regime that had maintained its grip on power for years through tight control of the media, the internet, and the flow of information. On the surface, the government still appeared to be in control, but in the digital space, cracks were beginning to form. Anonymous's intervention was neither loud nor theatrical. It was more like walking into a familiar building and noticing that the elevators worked one moment and stopped the next. Hallway lights flickered unpredictably. Doors were still locked, but the keys no longer fit. Tunisian government websites were repeatedly disrupted, internet censorship mechanisms were laid bare, and firewalls that had once seemed airtight began to show cracks. At the same time, Tunisian citizens gained access to technical tools that helped them bypass online surveillance. Not everyone understood how those tools worked, much like most of us use Wi-Fi every day without knowing what the router in our homes is actually doing. But the result was clear. Images, videos, and information began flowing outward beyond the government's control. Once information could no longer be completely blocked, repression began to falter. Each time the state tried to tighten its grip, a new way around it appeared, like a game of chase in which the referee was always one step behind. In the end, President Ben Ali fled the country, bringing to a close a regime once considered firmly entrenched. To the world, it was a revolution. To Mustafa, who was only 13 at the time, it was a moment of awakening. For the first time, he witnessed hacking not merely taking down a website or causing temporary disruption, but tipping the balance of power of an entire nation. Lines of code, once little more than intellectual puzzles after school, had become real leverage, quiet, invisible, yet powerful enough to change the course of events. And just 1 year later, Mustafa's life began to turn in a completely different direction, marking the moment when nothing was simple anymore. As he stepped out of the role of an observer and looked back at what Anonymous had become, Mustafa came to a clear realization. The movement had grown so large that it could no longer control itself. Realizing that Anonymous had grown too large and too uncontrolled did not push Mustafa to step away. Instead, at 16, he chose a different path, to shrink the game. Rather than remain part of a massive movement driven by mixed motives, Mustafa and a small group of equally skilled individuals decided to break away, operating more quietly, more quickly, and, in their own words, with less noise. That group was called LulzSec. LulzSec had 6 founding members. Among them, Mustafa was the youngest, but age was never the deciding factor. What set him apart was his ability to spot vulnerabilities before others even realized they existed, and his very low tolerance when those vulnerabilities appeared in systems he controlled himself. On one occasion, another hacker attempted to break into a website Mustafa was managing. The result? Mustafa didn't treat it as a joke. He struck back, taking full control of the attacker's system, a silent message that said, "Touch it, and there will be consequences." In that world, it was known simply as an initiation lesson. If Anonymous hacked to send a message, then LulzSec hacked to prove a simple point. Systems marketed as absolutely secure are usually only secure until they meet the wrong people. And the first target they chose was anything but small. The FBI, or more precisely, H.B. Gary, a cybersecurity firm that had been contracted by the FBI since 2010 to deal with hackers. When reports emerged suggesting that LulzSec could pose a threat, HB Gary CEO Aaron Barr chose not to stay quiet. He publicly announced that he would identify and expose the members of the group. To LulzSec, that moment was seen as an invitation. Mustafa quickly realized that the real weakness wasn't complex firewalls or expensive software, but a very ordinary habit on Barr's part, using the same password across most of his accounts. The result was catastrophic. More than 70,000 internal emails were leaked. Barr lost his job. His family received serious threats and was forced to relocate. A declaration of war ended in a way neither side had anticipated. But this was only the beginning of the real-world consequences of Operation Anti-Sec. LulzSec's next target was InfraGard, a non-profit organization designed to help the FBI securely share online information with government agencies and private companies. In theory, it functioned as a protective buffer. In practice, to LulzSec, it looked more like a central control panel. Touch one point, and the entire system is forced to respond. The InfraGard website was breached, login credentials were stolen, and once the data was in their hands, LulzSec chose not to simply sit back and observe. A phone call was made. On the other end of the line, the introduction was brief and delivered with procedural calm. "Hello, this is Barack Obama. I need to report an urgent ongoing cybersecurity threat." No further explanation was necessary. The call was quickly recognized as fake, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was not whether the FBI believed it, but that their systems had been accessed deeply enough for such almost simultaneously. The InfraGard website displayed a new message, placed where no one could miss it. Not a long manifesto, just a single sentence, delivered with cold mockery. "Let it flow. Your security systems are not as special as you think." To the public, it was dark humor. To the US government, it was a warning. At this point, President Barack Obama publicly declared war on cybercrime, labeling it a direct threat to national security. Pressure surged as a wave of breaches exposed the personal data of more than 100 million Americans.
In recent breaches, more than 100 million Americans had their personal data compromised.
The US government was determined to dismantle LulzSec. But for LulzSec, that reaction only reinforced a dangerous belief. They were no longer just looking for vulnerabilities. They were testing the reflexes of the entire system. And at the center of that chain of actions was Mustafa al-Bassam, just 16 years old at the time, slowly realizing that everything had gone far beyond where it had originally begun. From this point on, the question was no longer what LulzSec could do next, but whether there was any system fast enough to stop them. In 2011, Mustafa was 16 years old. LulzSec decided to aim directly at CIA.gov, the website representing one of the most powerful and secretive agencies in the United States. The group used a DDoS attack, a method designed to overwhelm a system. It can be understood like this: a narrow road suddenly flooded with tens of thousands of cars at the same time, bringing traffic to a complete standstill, even though no crash has occurred. The consequences appeared almost immediately. CIA.gov became inaccessible. Related services were disrupted, and technical teams were forced to respond as public attention began to mount. For roughly 4 hours, the CIA's website remained offline, long enough for everyone to understand that this was not a routine technical glitch. Afterward, LulzSec posted a public message on Twitter, confirming responsibility for the incident. That short tweet spread rapidly, appearing across forums, tech news outlets, and social media, transforming what might have been dismissed as a technical failure into a symbolic event. For LulzSec, this was seen as the peak of their power, not because they had taken control of the CIA's systems, but because they had forced a symbol of national security to respond under public scrutiny. An action carried out entirely in cyberspace, yet one that produced a clear, tangible effect in the real world. And from that moment on, the attention surrounding LulzSec no longer came from the online community. It shifted to the agencies that were quietly tracking their every move. Everything seemed to be moving forward, until one very ordinary morning. Mustafa was at home, in the familiar room where he had spent countless hours in front of a screen. There were no warning signs, no prior notice, just a sudden, forceful knock at the door, loud enough to shatter the silence. Outside stood British police officers. The search was carried out on the spot. Drawers were opened one by one. Devices were seized. Mustafa was taken to the station. There, he was told he was facing 80 criminal charges, each one tied to a separate cyber attack carried out by LulzSec. As the questions came relentlessly, Mustafa remained silent. Not out of fear, but because he understood that the game had moved beyond the digital world. And you might ask the same question Mustafa did at that moment. How could a group that had just forced the CIA to respond publicly be tracked down so quickly? The answer wasn't technology. It was a person. It was only later that the truth gradually came to light. Hector Monsegur, also known as Sabu, a co-founder of LulzSec, the person who connected its members and often pushed operations forward, had already been arrested by the FBI. But Sabu's story didn't begin in an interrogation room. It began with his life outside the internet. Sabu was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in poverty. His father was only 16 years old when he was left to raise him alone after Sabu's mother walked away. The family later moved to New York, living in public housing. By 2010, after his grandmother passed away, Sabu was forced to take responsibility for raising his two young nieces. Money was always scarce. Pressure was constant and overwhelming. When the FBI came for him, they didn't talk much about ideals or morality. They talked about prison time, about family responsibility, and about the children who still needed someone to care for them. This wasn't the kind of coercion you see in movies. It was a very human calculation. Sabu understood that if he disappeared behind bars, the people at home would be the first to pay the price, and Sabu made his choice. He cooperated with the FBI. But what made the betrayal especially brutal was this: Sabu never left LulzSec. He continued to show up as usual, kept chatting, kept participating in operations, including the attack on the CIA, all to maintain his cover. At the same time, he logged conversations, plans, and targets, feeding them to the FBI in real time. While the other members believed the group was still secure, the entire operation was already being monitored from the inside. Mustafa and the others had no idea. To them, Sabu was still Sabu, the talker, the connector, the one who kept pushing everything forward. After the raid, a detail that seemed minor at the time, but proved decisive, emerged. A police officer imposed a condition. Mustafa was banned from using the internet while awaiting legal proceedings. The decision was made quickly, almost as a matter of procedure, but its consequences would last far longer.
This was a condition that the police officer in charge set on a whim, and yet it completely changed the course of my life for the next 2 years.
Only then did Mustafa come to understand that LulzSec hadn't collapsed because a system was finally patched shut, nor because of a technical mistake. It collapsed because of a human choice, a decision made to protect a family in the real world. In May 2013, Mustafa appeared in court in the United Kingdom. After everything that had been inflated by the media, from headline-grabbing attacks to the staggering number of initial charges, the final verdict surprised many. Mustafa was convicted on just 2 counts. He received a 20-month suspended sentence, was ordered to complete more than 300 hours of community service, and was placed under strict monitoring for any computer equipment he used. The sentence was heavy enough to close one chapter, yet light enough to leave another path open. After the trial, Mustafa disappeared from sensational headlines, not because the story had lost its appeal, but because he chose to step out of the spotlight. In the years that followed, Mustafa returned to an academic path, pursuing a PhD in blockchain at University College London, a field that was still new at the time, largely overlooked, and not yet colored by the investment hype that would come later. Instead of trying to break systems, he focused on designing them and securing them. By 2021, Mustafa had co-founded Celestial Labs, a technology company focused on researching and building blockchain infrastructure. His role had fully transformed, from someone once prosecuted for cyber attacks to a cybersecurity advisor, invited to evaluate and protect the very systems he had once known how to bring down. That same year, Mustafa's name appeared on the Forbes Under 30 list, a symbolic milestone marking the shift from adversary to architect. Today, Mustafa's net worth is estimated to be between 5 and 10 million US dollars. But the more striking figure isn't found in a bank account. It lies in the paradox of his story. A teenager who once shook the most powerful institutions in the world ultimately became someone invited to protect the very systems he had once exposed. Mustafa's story does not end with a clear victory or a clear defeat. It ends with an open question of the digital age. Is the line between the breaker and the protector really as clear as we like to believe? The story of Mustafa al-Bassam comes to a close in a way very different from what people usually expect from a high-profile technology case. There are no prolonged images of handcuffs, no dramatic collapse, only a quiet shift of roles. From a teenager who once shook the most powerful systems in existence to someone invited to build and protect those very systems. Looking back at the entire journey, this is not simply a story about hacking or cybercrime. It is a story about choices in the digital age, a world where the line between right and wrong, between breaking and protecting, can sometimes be separated by a single, very human decision. A choice made to protect a family. A condition that seemed minor, yet was powerful enough to redirect an entire future, and a new path that only emerged after every old door had finally closed. Mustafa did not become a hero, nor did he end as a villain. He became a living proof of the digital world's paradox. The person who understands a system most deeply can be its greatest threat, or the only one capable of keeping it truly secure. And when the screen finally goes dark, this story leaves behind a question that still matters today. In the digital world, the one who understands a system best can break it.